Hi, this is Lisa with Coping with Yarn, and I'm going to be reading Chapter 3 of E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial in His Adventure on Earth, a novel by William Cotswinkle. Okay. It was here, right here. The extraterrestrial listened to the voices of the men who still paced back and forth upon the landing site, watching from the trees. He would infer the meaning of their speech. Here a wondrous craft had been and escaped them. Here a ship of wonder, such as their planet could only gape at, had descended and taken off again. And it slipped through my fingers. The leader, bearing the jingling ring of teeth, turned and turned again. His subordinates nodded stupidly. Their leader entered his vehicle and departed, and they followed him. It was day, and the landing site was empty. The extraterrestrial stared mournfully at the traces the ship had left. It slipped through my fingers. He raised a hand limply. Exhaustion had set in on him, and hunger. The powerful ration tablets he and his crewmates survived on, compressed little miracles of nutrition, were not of Earth. He had tried to chew a few bunch berries, found them most unsatisfying, and spat out the hard little seeds. During 10 million years of gathering wild plant life, he had never found it necessary to learn which ones were nutritious, and it was late in the game to start now. Oh, for one tiny ration tablet loaded with energy. He slouched back in the brush, weak, depressed, and itching all over from a species of trumpet creeper he had sampled. The end was near. Elliot pedaled along the street toward the far hills. He did not know why. The headlight of the bike was like a magnet heading for iron, buried in the hills. Yes, the bike seemed to know where to go, and he rode with it. Elliot was what is generally called a twerp. He cheated at Parcheesi. He had a shrill, screeching voice that came and went like a genie in a bottle, but always said just the wrong thing in class or at home during dinner. Whatever he could avoid in life, he avoided, hoping Mary would take care of it for him, or Michael. There were other things. The list was long, including thick eyeglasses that made him feel like a frog in a bottle. All in all, a blossoming neurotic, a twerp. His path in life led nowhere, but if place could be pointed to be on a map of the soul, Elliot's destination was mediocrity, miserliness, and melancholy, the sort of person who falls under a train. Something of the sort awaited him, a child psychologist would tell you, except that Elliot's path had veered today into the hills. He followed the bike's urgings up the far road. He climbed off and walked it over the cut foliage. His bike was dented and rusty from his having tossed it aside so often, abandoning it to rain, but today it seemed light as a feather. Today it seemed to shine like new, right through the rust. It led him through the forest, along a winding path. Elliot came to the clearing, and knew something incredible had been there. Everything seemed to bear the memory of the great ship. Squinting through his glasses at the imprinted grass, he could almost discern the shape the ship had been. Elliot's heart was beating loudly, and were there a light in it, it would have been on. His forehead seemed to be on fire, caught in the afterglow of an immense power that still lingered in the clearing. The old space being in the nearby bushes did not reveal his presence, for the boy's unpleasant dog might be sniffing about too, with hopes of biting a distinguished scientist on the ankle. But no, the youth seemed to be alone. Still, it was best to remain unnoticed. An extraterrestrial was about to expire in the underbrush, and there was no point in involving strangers. The boy, however, proceeded with a peculiar series of acts. He brought a bag from his pocket, from which he took a tiny object. He placed the object on the ground, walked a few paces, placed another, and another, and another, until he was out of sight, far along a hidden path. The ancient traveler crawled feebly from the bushes. Curiosity was his worst character trait, but he was too old to change now. On hands and knees, he entered the clearing to see what the youth had deposited there. It was a small round pill, bearing a remarkable resemblance to a space nutrition tablet. He turned it over in his palm. Upon it was printed an indecipherable code. M and M. He put it in his mouth and let it dissolve. Delicious! In fact, exquisite. Indeed, he had never tasted anything like it anywhere in the galaxy. He hurried along the trail, eating one pill after another, strength returning, hope surging in his heart. The trail led him to the boy's house once more. Mary served dinner, and it was one of her better meals. Raw wheat germs sprinkled on canned macaroni and cheese, with a handful of cashews tossed in to give a last touch of class. "Eat your supper, Elliot." He was hunched as always over the main course, as if preparing to snorkel his way into it. "I have raised a depressed child." Mary's mind flashed to previous dinners, those of another period where Elliot was younger and she and her husband had thrown butter knives at each other. Ouch. An entire chicken had bounced off the wall, and mashed potatoes had hung from the ceiling like stalactites, dripping of gravy into Elliot's tender young head. It could not have been good for him. She tried to brighten the present meal with chatter. "Well, how is everyone going to dress up for Halloween?" The dread evening was approaching fast. Her house would be visited by several hundred children singing off key and then staring at her. "Elliot's going as a goblin," said Michael. "Up yours," snarled Elliot. "Young man!" Mary rapped her fork on Elliot's glass. "Eat your macaroni." "Nobody believes me," said Elliot, and gazed still more gloomily into the gay repast. Mary stroked his hand. "It's not that we don't believe you, honey. It was real, I swear." Elliot looked at her from behind his thick glasses, over large eyes filled with pleading. Mary turned to Gertie, the last child in the family, 5 years old and already asking for her own apartment. "Gertie, honey, what are you going as on Halloween?" "Bo Derek." The image of her infant daughter parading naked and wet down the block flooded Mary's taxed mind. She fumbled with her macaroni and tried to think of another subject, but Michael was circling back in on Elliot. "Maybe," said Michael in his superior brother way, "it was an iguana." "I've got the iguanas," said Mary softly into a cashew. "It was no iguana," said Elliot. "Well," said Michael, "you know how there's supposed to be alligators in the sewers?" "Alligators," thought Mary. "I could start counting alligators as a change." She closed her eyes and a great big one appeared, teeth sparkling. She turned back to Elliot. "Elliot, all your brother is saying is that you probably just imagined it. This happens. We all imagine lots of things all the time. I imagine myself entering the sale rack and finding a displaced Dior for $2. I make a stunning entrance into McDonald's." "I couldn't have imagined it," said Elliot. "Maybe," said Michael, "it was a pervert." "Please, Michael," said Mary, "don't imprint Gertie with that sort of talk." "What's a pervert, Mommy?" "He's just a man in a raincoat, honey." "Or," continued Michael, "a deformed child." "Michael," she gave him a silencial look. Why were children's minds so enamored of freakish explanations? Why was every dinner conversation like this? Where was the elegant banter of refinement as the second course, frozen fish sticks, was served? "Well," persisted Michael, ignoring her order for silence as he ignored all her other orders, "maybe it was an elf or a leprechaun." Elliot threw down his fork. "It was nothing like that, penis breath." "Penis breath?" Mary sat back, eyes wide. How had that expression come into her little family circle? All the elements of the expression came to her slowly. Then, and she had to admit it was an organic possibility, one that could even produce a certain wistfulness in a lonely divorcee's mind. But, Elliot, you are never to use that expression at the dinner table again, or anywhere else in this house. Elliot slouched back in the tablecloth. Dad would have believed me. Why don't you call him and tell him? If his phone is still connected, which I doubt. I can't, said Elliot. He's in Mexico with Sally. Mary maintained her poise, sagging only a little way into the fish sticks, as the name of her former friend, now hated enemy, was invoked. Children can be so cruel, she reflected, especially Elliot. If you see it again, whatever it was, don't go near it. Call me and we'll have someone take it away. Like the dog catcher? Asked Gertie. Exactly. Harvey growled softly on the back porch where he was chewing the welcome mat. But, said Elliot, they'll give it a lobotomy or do experiments or something. Well, said Mary, it should learn to stay out of other people's cucumbers. However, it was crawling from the trees as the town slept. It had never heard of lobotomy, but it had reason to fear being stuffed. The aged creature's toes carried him along quietly toward the boys' house. Down the hillside he went, leaving the mark of large melon being dragged by a pair of duck-billed platypuses. The boys' house was dark, only one tiny window glowing. He peered over the fence, great eyes rolling up, down, around. The dog was nowhere in sight. Let me just get my toe up on the latch in accepted fashion and then swing on in. The great M&Ms had given me my vitality back, a miraculous food. The ship would return in 1,000 years if the M&Ms held out. Perhaps he would make it. Stop dreaming, you old fool. You'll never get back. There. He looked at the sky, but not for long, for the sadness written in it was too great. No amount of M&Ms would keep him going if the love of his shipmates were gone from his sight. Why had they deserted him? Couldn't they have held on a moment longer? He closed the gate behind him with his foot, as seen the boy do. He must learn these ways of earth if he was to succeed. He tiptoed across the backyard. To his surprise, he found the boy asleep in a sack beside the vegetables. The child was breathing lightly. A faint mist escaped his lips, for the night was cold. The extra-terrestrial shivered himself, and his own mist poured out of his toes, mists of worry, fear, confusion. Suddenly the boy's eyes opened, and Elliot looked up into enormous eyes like moon jellyfish with faint tentacles of power within them. Eyes charged with ancient and terrible knowledge, eyes that seemed to scan every atom of his body. The extra-terrestrial stared down, horrified by the boy's protruding nose and large exposed ears, and worst of all by his tiny little eyes, dark and beady as those of a coconut. But the tiny sunken eyes of the child blinked, and the terror in them touched the old scientist's heart. He extended a long finger. Elliot shrieked and scrambled backward, clutching his sleeping bag around him. The extra-terrestrial jumped in the other direction, stumbling over himself, and emitting an ultrasonic squeak, which brought a bat sweeping down out of the darkness, but only momentarily, for one pass at the space monster sent the aerial rodent fluttering back into the night, teeth chattering. Elliot's own teeth were clicking like a bag full of marbles, while his knees clacked back and forth, and the hair stood up on his neck. Where was Harvey the Protector, dog of the hearth? On the back porch, teeth clicking, knees clacking, fur standing up, the terrified Beach crouched, sprang at the door, bounced back, and chased his tail. The scent he had in his nose was like nothing he had never sniffed before, with aromas of far-flung spaces no sane dog would ever want to investigate. He crouched back down, only the tip of his snout sticking out through a crack in the door. More of the scent floated toward him, and he cringed and began chewing the end of a broom. The creature from space was taking another tentative step toward Elliot. Elliot's eyes widened in terror, and he stepped backward. He had zero courage, had errands to run, Homework to do, chores to perform, 1,000 things, anything but this. Monstrous eyes scanned his nature, and he could feel the probes far down in himself, shooting energy through him, questioning, calculating, analyzing. The hideous creature's lips were shaped in a frightening grimace, sharp little teeth grinding together. What did it want? Elliot felt it trying to communicate. The ancient wanderer held out his hand and opened it, and within the huge scaly palm was his last M&M melting. Elliot looked down at the little candy, and then looked up at the monster. The monster pointed a long finger into his palm, and then pointed into his mouth. "Okay," said Elliot softly, and he opened his jacket, took out his bag of M&Ms, and backed slowly away, continuing to lay a trail across the yard. His knees were still knocking, and his teeth was still clicking violently, upsetting some expensive orthodontic work. The elderly space traveler followed, picking up each M&M and swallowing it down hungrily. This was the food of the gods, of kings, of conquerors. Were he to survive his ordeal on Earth, he would bring a sample of this miraculous food to his captain. For with it universes could be crossed in supreme flight. Chocolate gerbled from the corner of the spaceman's mouth. His fingers were coated with it too, and he licked it off deliriously, his strength returning. He could feel the miraculous substance coursing through his veins, bearing its secret chemistry to his brain, where blips of joy and light were going off. Now he understood the meaning of Earth life. 10 billion years of evolution to produce the M&M. What more could one ask of a planet? Grabbing at the little pills, he tracked his way quickly across the lawn, and before he knew it, he had followed the trail into the Earthling's house. His eyes revolved in terror. The alien would surround him on all sides now, each corner, each object. Every shadow was a devastating shock to his system, but he had to endure it in order to acquire the miraculous M&M. He followed the trail up a flight of stairs and down a hallway to the boys' room, where the child rewarded him with a handful of M&Ms. He devoured them in one gulp, and it seemed a rash act, but who knew what tomorrow would bring? The boy's voice box sounded. "I'm Elliot." The words were a jumble, incomprehensible, but anyone who would share their M&Ms could be trusted. The extra-terrestrial sank down on the floor, exhausted, and a blanket came around him, and he slept. Elliot lay awake for a long while, not daring to sleep. The monstrosity was on the floor beside his bed, grotesque shape outlined beneath the blanket. Where had it come from? He only knew that it wasn't from this earth. He fought to understand, but it was like trying to take a handful of fog. Waves of power filled the room, visible the way heat in the desert is visible, in a shimmering dance that rises upward. Within that shimmer, Elliot felt a brilliant awareness moving. Even while the creature slept, a sentry seemed to watch in its shimmer and to study the room and the windows and the night. A low whine from the hallway told Elliot that Harvey had slipped off the back porch again, and that the dog was crouched outside his door. He heard a gnawing sound of earth on the doorframe, and the thump-thump of the dog's tail. "What's in there?" the perplexed canine was asking himself as he nervously chewed wood. The shimmer that Elliot saw was touching him too, probing his muddled dog thoughts. The cur whimpered and pawed the door, and then sank back down, not really wanting to be let in, not wanting to get any closer to the shimmering wave that pulsed like an old bone. A choice bone, an ancient bone, but one of the frightening sort, with thunder in the marrow. Elliot turned on the side and put one arm under his pillow. Sleep was after him, though he wanted to watch, to stand guard. But his eyelids were heavy, and he was sliding into home plate. Sliding, down, down, down. He landed on a Parcheesi board, the one he cheated on, and his feet seemed mirrored in it. But then he saw a trail of little candies, each one glowing like gold, the trail of M&Ms he'd laid for his monstrous friend. And the trail became a beautiful road through the world, and he took it. And that's the end of chapter 3.
Be good.